Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. My name is Polly Hunt, and I'm with AARP Massachusetts. As many of you know, at AARP, we are fierce advocates for what matters most to older adults, whether it's protecting essential services, fighting fraud, or promoting age friendly communities. We fight every day to make sure older adults are heard, valued, and supported. Today, we're very excited to welcome Doug Ellis, a tour guide from the Concord Visitor Center, to share a little bit about our country's history with you. Doug, I will pass it over to you now.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great day. Just have to say this is a little bit of a surreal experience. I feel like I'm talking to myself looking at my own monitor. But we will get started. And like she said, I am Doug Ellis. I am a tour guide at the Visitor Center. If you're by on Wednesdays, I give the town tour every Wednesday, generally speaking. I'm also the chairman of the Concord Historical Commission. I'm very, very proud of doing that. I'm probably the least qualified to be there, but we've got a great team, and I'm very, very proud to be a member of that group. Also, past captain of the Concord Minutemen. Um, what a great group that is. That's been just a whole lot of fun, especially in light of the 250th that we had this year. And I got to command all the folks up on the bridge. We had 43 muskets, including some redcoats. So that was a lot of fun. Also a USS Constitution Marine. So when I'm wearing this hat, so that's always a lot of fun. So we get to go out on Constitution when they do turnarounds. We do educations. We're part of a nonprofit, the 1812 Historical Marine Education. So it's a nonprofit group really meant to spread education about the early Marines and what they've done for the Constitution. So with that, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So the title was the shot heard around the world, but before we get into the actual what happened, we need to talk about why it happened, what happened, what got us there. So there are the tensions that rose between Britain and the colonies. This isn't a light thing that happened. This was a big deal. So, how protests turned into resistance, how taxes turned into more than just taxes, kind of what happened, Lexington and Concord, what led up to those events. Ordinary people like you and me banding together to make things change. And what the shot heard around the world means to us today, or doesn't mean to us today. And at the end, I've got plenty of time. I'm sure we'll have for questions that you might want to ask. So before we get started, Polly, can you put up the first poll?
All set. Hopefully, everybody sees that.
Yeah,
And if you are on your phone or computer, if you want to just put in your answer, and I'll end the poll in a second so we can see the answers.
so I'd love to know how many people, where are we on this spectrum of knowing everything or knowing, very, very little and then kind of coming at it from a curiosity perspective. We give tours to people every day and we assume that you don't know much. So, we're going to start from that. But if you do, maybe we can dive a little bit deeper and just have a little bit of fun with it.
Great. Okay, I think I will close it. We've got about 80% people who have answered, so I will end
Okay.
that poll and sharing the results here. Do you see that?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's a good mix, kind of in the middle. So that's good. Okay.
Great.
All right. So let's get in, why can't we just get along, right? So I had the captain of the 5th Regiment of Foot surrender to me, but it was 250 years late. So, what does that mean? Um, so kind of getting into it, you gotta page back a few years. 1763. We're all part of England. We just finished a long war with France, and wars are expensive. And as you can see on the map here, there's a whole lot of land, a whole lot of territory that was involved with the conflict. So we had all the British, which was already in the red. France had all that was in the blue. There was a lot of battling on the North American side up through Canada, through the oceans, but it left England very, very depleted, and it needed to get some money. So what do? Let's raise some taxes, right? Simple way to get some revenue. So, the Stamp Act was the first thing put in 1765, and it didn't go over well. So it was a tax on tea, and it was, and excuse me, on documents and cards and anything that was paper. And, it's the classic taxation without representation. We had no voice in Parliament. Colonists didn't vote for this tax, so why did we get it? And you also have to think that I didn't put on the slide, really, who did this impact? Is a typical farmer going to be impacted by this? Maybe, but I mean, you think about documents, newspapers. These are most likely going to be people of more means, more people who are educated, people of influence, you might say. And being of influence, they have more influence and more voice to send that back to to London to let them know that this was not okay. And by the way, they were doing a lot of these same things in on the continent of in the European continent, and it didn't go over very well there either. But there were boycotts, protests. There was the activists, Sons of Liberty, formed, and they made sure that the taxes were never collected. So it didn't last very long. So they say, oh, okay, we'll repeal that, but we still need something. So they put out another series of tariffs. They didn't call them tariffs, but they were tariffs. So this was a fee that was a hidden tax. So you didn't really see it. So it would come in, it would get paid at the port. So then by the time it was sold to the end consumer, they didn't see the price was already in whatever it is that they were sold. But it was glass, paint, paper, still paper, and tea collected at the ports. They still needed the revenue. They needed to pay the people who were under the crown's payroll. So they still needed to get the money, but this was their way to do it. But again, taxation without representation. Colonies really feared that they were going to lose control over their own legislative affairs, and that they were going to be ceding this to Mother England. And when the colonies were formed, they were given different rights. And in Massachusetts, anyway, in 1690, they were given a charter that declared what they were allowed to do. And they did not feel like this fell under that charter. So there were wide scale boycotts. There was a lot of smuggling. There was a lot of things coming in from the Dutch, homemade alternatives. So they did what they could to really limit what was affected by the taxes. But hostilities still remained. And the British who were here, of course, there were soldiers who were stationed here. Not like they were occupying at the time, they were just there. But in Boston and other places, they would often be harassed by crowds. And in one particular case, on March 5th, 1770, there was a skirmish in front of the customs house. Tensions were very, very high. The soldiers were there. The crowds were there. They were taunting the soldiers, and eventually, violence broke out. People were killed, and at the end of the day, John Adams was the guy who defended the soldiers and vindicated them because it really wasn't their fault. But the tensions were there, and as you can see from this print, which was made widespread, it really became inflammatory. So this is a Paul Revere print that was publicized just to show the violence. But if you were to see this, then you would really think that it was the British who were the aggressors. So it was a lot of marketing on the behalf of the colonists to get sway to their cause. So fast forward a little bit more, December 1773, British colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of our favorite beverage into the Boston harbor. So, again, taxation without representation. But did you know that there were not just this one ship, there were 6 ships, and they were sent to all different ports along the coast of America. So there was one to New York, there was Philadelphia, there was Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia. They all met different fates. There was one that was shipwrecked off of Cape Cod, and some of that was sold. They took what they could, and they salvaged it, and they relished that. Others were turned away at the port. Others they refused to empty. Others they just never let land. But in Boston, it was different. In Boston, they really wanted to make a point. So the Sons of Liberty staged this to really make a big deal out of it. And big deal they did. So the king was not amused. He was livid over this. Now, there were different sides at the time, and our friend Ben Franklin was ambassador, and he was in England. So he was there, and he knew who the friends were, and he knew who the opponents were. Um, but it was very clear that the king wanted absolutely no part of this and wanted to come down with a very, very swift arm. So he shut down the port of Boston. He declared martial law. So the Massachusetts government was very limited. You could have town meeting once a year, revoke self-rule, quartering act to let soldiers live in colonist homes. Now, there's some debate about this, whether it actually let them live in their homes or whether it was just if they had buildings that were available and not being used. But basically, this whole thing, the coercive became the coercive or the intolerable acts. And this really, really set off tensions in Massachusetts. So the colonies really rallied to this. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia understood what was going on here, and this was a rallying point around supporting Massachusetts and what was going on up here. So the Massachusetts colonies, especially Boston, was the main target. But all of New England gathered in support of Boston and what was going on. Grassroots operations came up, militias mobilized. Now let's talk about militias. Every town had a militia. Ever since the 1600s, every man from the age of 16 to 60 was required to be in the local militia, and they drilled 4 times a year. That was generally their plan. And many of them had fought in the French and Indian War, so these guys were not these were no strangers to armed conflicts or to the weaponry. The most important thing, though, is we've got the unity from the different colonies so we can have a conversation and a dialogue going forward with our fellow colonists. So here's one. How many of you guys know about the powder alarm? So we don't have a poll on that, but probably not a lot. But this was a really, really big deal. So September 1st, 1774, the British troops wanted to make a really quick raid on some supplies of munitions that the colonists had, get in and out quickly, and be gone before they ever knew they were there. And it worked. They were in and out, but the word did get out to the colonists. And they thought, oh my God, war has begun. The word spread all across New England, and within days, thousands upon thousands of militia were marching in on Boston, only to find that nothing was going on, and whatever did take place was already done. But that triggered them to really think about, wow, this is really something that we need to address. So they formed the Provincial Congress. They met in Concord. They met at the First Parish, would have been the meeting house at the time. And this is a picture here of the Wright Tavern, which stands today. and which is open to visitors every day. I believe now from I believe from 10 till 5 o'clock. There's a $10 admission, but you can go in and get a guided tour of each of the rooms. But in this here in Concord, the provincial Congress met and they discussed how to make preparations for what might happen in case hostilities did break out. So they needed provisions. They needed to gather things. They formed a legitimate body where they could meet outside the influence of Boston, where the king's soldiers really didn't have a lot of influence, or at least they couldn't get there without it being very widely known, and they could take measures before they ever got there. So they declared themselves the sole governing authority for Massachusetts. They ordered to train and enroll militia and forming the Minutemen. So we've all heard Minutemen. I heard militia and Minutemen. What are the difference? Well, the Minutemen are the first responders. They're the ones who, on a minute's notice, pledged to be ready to be able to answer the call of an alarm. They were, whether they were out in the field, whether they were having a meal, they had to have all the provisions they needed ready to go so that they could drop it and head off. Um, the Minutemen were then required, instead of the 4 times a year training, these guys trained twice a week. These guys were ready to go. These guys were the young whippersnappers, and a company such as Concord. Concord had 2-minute companies. We always talk about just the Concord Minutemen. There were 2-minute companies. They had 50 soldiers roughly each in them. Back to or provincial Congress, they had a committee on safety to act as the executive body. They began stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in Concord and in Worcester, and they raised funds. So don't have it on this slide, but we talk about what they were looking for. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but this isn't a small amount of material that they were stashing away. This was a lot of material. They were stashing away enough to supply 15,000 soldiers, enough for 6 months. So if we think about the town of Concord today, Concord is a town of about 18,000, has been for generations. Per man, woman, and child in Concord, you'd have enough supplies for 6 months. That's significant. That's not a couple of soldiers stockpiling things in their barns and their farms. This was a significant portion of the town supplying things and storing things like flour and food supplies, musket balls, cannonballs, gunpowder, muskets, small cannons, some big cannons. They were a lot of places, and they all had to be taken care of. And it also means that it's not just the soldiers who were involved. It was every man, woman, and child who had to participate in this. So General Gage gets wind of this, and he starts working on a plan. Early in March, he sends out some spies, and they make their way to the countryside, and they get some, of course, being New England and being really kind of small town America, they're the strangers in town that they don't know, they picked up on it pretty quickly. But the plan was to send 700 British troops from Boston to Concord to seize the weapons and arrest their leaders. So John Hancock and Sam Adams were who they were looking for. The intelligence from the Patriots was really deep. They knew things. They actually knew where the British soldiers and their leaders were going before the British soldiers and leaders knew it. They had intercepted a lot of these messages from London, and they got them before even General Gage. So they knew that it was coming. So on the night of April 18th, a number of riders were given the alarm that the regulars were on the march. Now it's rumored that there were upwards of 40 riders. So we know about Dawes and Revere. Those are the ones, the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Everybody knows of that. But they rode out to warn the countryside. If you see on the map on the northern route, the Paul Revere went up along the Mystic River, He met with a British patrol. He was planning on going through Cambridge, but he had to divert. He went over and he made it up to Lexington. William Dawes made the southern route. Now keep in mind too, at that time, Boston was almost an island. It was a peninsula with a very thin neck at the south, and that was the only way on or off by land. So Dawes had to very sneakily get through there without being sighted. So through all Middlesex cities and towns, Paul Revere was on the march. He did make it to Lexington. They both made it there around midnight, 1 a.m. Then they continued on to warn Concord. They were joined by Samuel Prescott, a very young physician from Concord who is visiting his girlfriend in Lexington. And he is the only one who actually made it all the way to Concord. The others were um, captured by a Major Mitchell along the way. Um, but Revere, being a good storyteller, spun a yarn, said that there were 1,000 soldiers ready, just about to descend upon Lexington. And that was enough to let Mitchell head back to warn the column that was approaching Lexington, to give them some warning. Of course, that wasn't true. So Revere ended up walking back to Lexington, and he was there when the soldiers met. But just before sunrise, the British troops arrived and confronted Captain John Parker, and the shots were fired. So the next slide after this, I've got a better kind of blow up of what this looks like. So it was around 5 a.m., 700 regulars, led by Major Pitcairn, who was a Marine, arrived at Lexington Green. 70 militia were there under John Parker. Parker told them, stand their ground. He was trying to make a statement. He wasn't going to move, but he wasn't going to attack. That didn't really work so well. They were eventually told to disperse. The Major Pitcairn marched back and forth and said, lay down your arms, scoundrels, lay down your arms. They never did. They did back off, but then they were ordered, the regulars were ordered to charge with bayonets, and some fired. Um, there were shots fired. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, but shots were fired, and 8 militiamen were killed. So that really, I mean, this was the first small shed of bloodshed in this particular engagement. But word of this, in addition to just the regulars being on the march, really spread. And if that didn't inflame the emotions of the day, I don't know what would. So here we have another etching of what this looked like. This was done by, there's a series of prints here that were done by a man by the name of Amos Doolittle, who came through Lexington and Concord a couple of weeks after the battles, interviewed the participants, and put these together from what he had heard from the stories. So here you can see in the center, you see the regulars firing, and on the left and on the top, you can see the regulars in formation. Behind you see the meeting house where they had met, the belfry to the right, which had rung out, alarming the town that the regulars were on the march. And then on the left, the building there, that structures the Buckman Tavern, which still exists. And it's right next to the Lexington Visitor Center if you're ever in Lexington. So the regulars march on. They arrive in Concord, and at around 8 o'clock in the morning. Sleepy little farming town, but they were warned. So Samuel Prescott ran into town at first, and he rang out the courthouse bell to alarm everyone in the countryside. They knew that they were coming, but the church bell confirmed everything. Pastor William Emerson came down from the old manse with his musket. He was the patriot soldier, what do they call him? The Patriots chaplain, but he was also a soldier. Came down, and the search began. So the British came. If you see here, this another Doolittle print. Again, you see the Wright Tavern here in the center with 700 soldiers marching on the town. To the left, you see the meeting house for the first parish. And in the foreground, you see the cemetery of the Old Hill Burying Ground. Now, if you were to go to Concord today or anytime this week, this is actually a place we bring people or visitors on the regular daily walking tour. We show this print because you can very easily see this almost today and imagine what it must have been like. But regardless of that, the Wright Tavern, where the Minutemen had met pre-dawn to plan out their course of attack, met at the Wright Tavern. By the time the regulars came, the Minutemen actually marched the regulars in. They knew that they were badly outnumbered. They weren't going to put up any resistance. They saw them coming. They lined up in front of them, and 50 of them marched in with the regulars with their fifes and drums blaring to further alarm the town. When they got to the town, however, they retreated to Punkatasset Hill, farther out from town. If it's past the Old North Bridge, if you know where that is. At the time, the land was clear cut, as you can see pretty much from this print, so they could get a pretty good view of what was going on. The British now, they left about 100 in the town, 300 went to the South Bridge, 300 went to the North Bridge. At the North Bridge, 100 stayed behind to guard the North Bridge, while another 200 continued on to search the countryside, and in particular, Colonel Barrett's farm. So here's another view of what it looked like, and one can only imagine. So you've got Major Pitcairn and Francis Colonel Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, they're surveying the town and what's going on. So what happened at the North Bridge? So we know that that was the engagement. So the Minutemen, first of them, the Concord Minute companies, as I said to begin with, there was about 100 of them. So they retreated. They went across the North Bridge and they went into the high ground behind it, up to Punkatasset Hill. But as they were there and as they waited, more and more minute companies arrived from surrounding towns. Groton, Westford, Bedford, Billerica. They kept Sudbury. They marched in, they kept more and more and more. And by around 9 o'clock in the morning, there were 400 of them. There's 100 at the bridge. Now there's 200 doing behind them, doing the countryside, or 200, but still, they definitely had the numbers. So while on the hill, they could see smoke rising from the town, and they didn't know what exactly that was. They said, "Are they burning our town? Will we let them burn our town?" They conferred, and the captains agreed that they should march on the bridge. They loaded their muskets and they advanced, given the orders, "Do not fire unless fired upon." When they got almost to the bridge, the regulars were in an absolute panic. As you can probably see, I'll blow up this print next so you can see it a little bit better. Do it right now, actually. The regulars are on the right, the colonials are on the left. They march towards the bridge and they're in what's called street formation. So they're actually in a line. So they're really not in a very good position to be firing against each other. But the regulars fired a warning shot that was pretty harmless. It didn't hit anybody, but they reloaded, they shot again, and they took out Captain Isaac Davis, the captain of Acton, and Abner Hosmer, a fifer from Acton. And when that happened, Major Buttrick from Concord commanded, "Fire, for God's sakes, fellow soldiers, fire!" And that was the first time that colonial troops had been ordered to act against the king's soldiers. And that from Ralph Waldo Emerson picked some years later to be called the shot heard around the world. So from that point, they didn't continue the fight. It was a very, very quick skirmish. The regulars retreated into the town where they regained their numbers. The minute companies, on the other hand, retreated to the backside of the hills. So they were out of sight and definitely not in a they're a very defensible position so that they're not going to be attacked or flanked by the regulars. They advanced around the town to the other side to what's Miriam's Corner. So when they left around noon, so this is another 3 hours that they were there searching because that was their mission. Their mission was to really disarm or disable anything that they found. These poor guys had been marching all through the night. They knew that the countryside knew that they were coming. It was an 18-mile trip there. They're tired, they're hungry, they're cold. I'm sure this is April. They had to march through water and swamp. And now they dallied long enough that instead of there being a few hundred, now we're talking hundreds and thousands of militia coming after them on their retreat back. So they were harassed relentlessly all the way back. There were colonial ambushes in towns like Lincoln, Monotony, Cambridge, British officers, fatigue, confusion. It would have been really, really hard. By the time the regulars reached Lexington, they had their reinforcements from Percy. Percy was there. He brought in 1,000 regulars with cannons, and he was really ready. So he protected them and got them back. Unfortunately, there's probably a 5 to 8 hour delay in Percy being given the word to send the reinforcements. So he really could have been used a lot earlier, but at the end of the day, um, by the end of the battle, the British made it to Charlestown. They'd suffered nearly 300 casualties. The colonies had made it clear this was not just a protest, that this was war. There is absolutely no going back from this day's activities. Basic stats, British regulars, there were the 700 that saw the whole day. There were the 1,000 that saw the end of the day. 73 killed, 174 wounded, 26 missing. On the militia side, thousands, well over 4,000, 49 killed, 39 wounded, 5 missing, 93 casualties. But this was a very long day, a very important day, and a very costly day to the regulars. So, kind of final thoughts on this. It wasn't just the start of a battle, it was the start of a revolution. This was no small thing that happened. Ordinary people, extraordinary courage. Farmers, blacksmiths, ordinary people like you would see today. It wasn't a consequence or a conquest. These folks were out there protecting what they had. They saw what Britain could do to conquested lands like Ireland, like Scotland, even like Quebec. We could talk about that too. That's a whole other topic. And they did not want that to happen here. That basically, although there was slavery in Concord, there was roughly 10% of the population was enslaved. And I should also add, they felt like that enslavement would take place to them as well, and they would lose their farms, and they'd be serving a British lord for their future. And they saw it coming, and they did not find that acceptable at all. Although eventually we fought for liberty and got freedom, it wasn't freedom for all. So these are things that we constantly have to battle with and can continue our fights. Um, it showed Lexington and Concord that self-government and liberty are worth defending. It's not something that we're willing to give away lightly. And that, the shot heard around the world reminds us that freedom, not often, it always begins with local action. It always starts with a spark. And we might think back on this particular battle and say, how could this whole thing have been avoided? If they didn't have the Boston Tea Party, if that didn't happen, if King George would have lightened up a little bit, if he didn't send such a harsh response, may things had turned out differently. Um, Very, very thought provoking. We'd be in a very different position today. So with that, open up to questions. Have any questions, Polly?
I see one question in the chat, which was posted. Why do we celebrate the 4th of July, but not April 19th?
Well, you don't live in Concord. If you
That's right.
lived in Concord, we celebrate April 19th and barely the 4th of July.
Yeah.
4th of July is a national holiday. That's when we as a nation, the 13 colonies, declared independence against England. Um, that's a really, really big deal. I think until that point, I think there was hope of reconciliation. There was hope that there'd be some kind of a diplomatic solution out of it. Um, but you know, it really hadn't happened.
Great. We have a question in the Q&A. If you can put questions in the Q&A, that's preferred, but if some people are on phones and it's harder to find where that is, you can put it in the chat as well. So we have one question in the Q&A. It says at midnight, John Hancock and Samuel Adams were moved to Amos Wyman's house for safety. Is that house still there? And the person who wrote this is sharing that Amos Wyman was her first cousin 7 times removed.
Okay. Yes, it is still there. And I could add that my father-in-law grew up there part of his childhood.
Ah, very cool.
Yeah,
Very cool. Okay, so the house is still there.
the
Great.
house is still there.
Great.
And
Wonderful.
oh yeah, if there are yeah, when we could probably skip the side. I completely jumped through the questions, the polls.
It's okay. Do we still have more questions coming this way? Do you
Yeah,
want to
let's
do
keep
the
let's keep doing the questions.
Yeah, great. Okay. Then we have from Joyce, when did George Washington enter the fight?
Um, Great question. Shortly thereafter, so George Washington came up, it was around the time of Bunker Hill. So, we had April 19th was the big thing for Lexington and Concord. But then from that point on, um, the regulars were really barricaded into the city and they were not able to leave that at all. So then that became the big thing was to really entrap them. So that's what led to Bunker Hill and to be able to fortify that. Now the colonists lost that battle, but it was significant because the regulars paid a tremendous cost on that, and they realized that this was not going to be something easy. But it was over the next coming months that George Washington came up to Cambridge. And also, interestingly, that I don't know if most people know that the dormitories at Harvard College were used by the infantry, the colonial infantry, and the students had to go somewhere. So from the summer of 1775 until the regulars left in 1776, Harvard College met in Concord, Massachusetts.
Great. Okay, we have more questions coming in. So we have from Andrew, if this didn't happen in Concord or Lexington, would it have happened later at a different location?
That's a great question, and I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that.
Mm,
Um, but you could see that there were people in Boston who were really intent on doing this, really of the independence movement, and it was um, the propaganda, for lack of another word, the publications, the things that raise people's emotions, the social media at the time, the speeches by influential people, and then of course the spark of the Tea Party. So I mean, there wasn't a Tea Party elsewhere. They didn't do that. And I think that's significant. It may not have happened. I'm starting to think more and more that it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been sparked in Boston.
mm. Then we have a question from William here. Is there a friendly rivalry between Lexington and Concord as to where things really started?
That's a great cue for a poll.
Oh, okay, I love it. All right, let me get out of the Q&A. And then, so this is question number 2 for the poll, is that right?
Don't go to three. Go to three. Two,
Go to
two. I think
3. Okay.
we can skip two.
Okay, great. All right, so I will do 3. So we have another poll for everybody here. Hopefully you're seeing this on your screen. Where do you think the shot round the world was fired?
And I'm not allowed to vote, but I have my own opinion.
All right, everybody has answered who is on, so I will end uh, and share the results.
Ooh. Well, it's clear then Concord wins.
Yeah,
So the so this has been an ongoing debate between Lexington and Concord. It's kind of it's doesn't matter, not really. I mean, the engagement sparked the revolution. However,
hmm
having said that, the term "shot heard around the world" was coined by Ralph Waldo Emerson when he wrote the Concord Hymn, which was for the monument that went up on the British side of the Old North Bridge in 1635. He wrote it then, but it was never put on the bridge. On the Minuteman statue that went up in 1875, it's actually printed there, the Emerson's Conquered Him, and there the quote, the shot heard and launched the shot heard around the world. So it could be a figurative shot, it could be an actual shot. However, in Lexington, you had a militia that was ordered to stand down who never did fire a shot. They were victims. In Concord, you had a group of militia not only standing their ground, but taking affirmative action to fire against the king's soldiers. To me, that's a much bigger deal. Um, but that being said, this battle has gone on for over a century. Um, in 1875, General Grant, or General President Grant, came to visit Lexington and Concord, but he almost didn't because the towns were fighting amongst each other so much around where the shot heard around the world was fired. So, you know, we can all agree to disagree, but it was the day that mattered, not necessarily the shot.
great. Okay, we have a few
Although
more
you know my
questions.
opinion.
All right, from William, we have, did anyone come in from surrounding states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire?
Not that day. I don't believe so. It would have just been too far. The farthest that made it to the battle, I believe, was like Salem, which is 25 miles or so. Um, no, I think they made it to Concord. They made it to the area, but not that day. Now, if we're talking like the powder alarm, absolutely they did. They came in from all over, but it took a while.
Okay, great. Then we have in the chat here, why didn't the British, and there's a typo, I'm gonna just interpret this, why didn't the British negotiate with the colonists?
Um, Arrogance. The, the the king just believed we are Great Britain, we have the power. You are a bunch of upstart farmers who will not have the gumption to stand up against an armed military. Once they see us, you're going to crumble. And that just wasn't the case. That just wasn't the case. There were people, there were different people in the king's circle who believed that peace could be, but their voice was just extinguished. They just made it clear they didn't want to hear any of that. I mean, we don't
Okay.
know any politicians today, anybody in government who just doesn't want to hear anything but their own way, right? I mean, things have not changed
Mm. Then we have from the same person, did the British underestimate the role of the colonists?
vastly,
Yeah.
absolutely. Now, I think it's more. So General Gage was here in Boston with thousands of troops, but he knew that any given time this kindling could ignite and he would be vastly outnumbered and he would just have absolutely no chance. And that's exactly what happened. So he was walking on pins and needles trying to do these little skirmishes to raid these supplies. But he had been asking for 20,000 soldiers for a long time, and he didn't have a fraction of that. He had, I think, 4 or 5,000 or something like that in Boston at the time that they went on the march. So yeah, They were definitely outnumbered.
Okay. We have two more questions that just came in. So we have one from David. When was the Continental Congress formed?
That I don't. I'm Lexington, Concord stuff, Continental or a provincial Congress that started in Salem and then moved briefly and then moved to Concord. Continental Congress, I don't know. I don't know. It would have been significantly before that, though.
Okay, great. And then another test of your history, were the British fighting any European or international wars in 1775?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
No, France was the big one. That was over, so they're licking their wounds, regrouping.
Yep. And we have another one that just came in from Joyce. How many soldiers did the British have, and how many did militia have?
Well, militia, that I think that was my last slide, and
Yeah.
I assume that you're talking about in the running battle. So they marched to Concord with 700. When they got to Concord, the militia had 400. By the time they left Concord, the militia was probably around 1,000, let's just say. By the time they got to Miriam's Corner, just leaving Concord, probably in that 1,000 range to 700. By the time they got to Lexington, and then that whole run from Lexington up to Charlestown, where they finished, upwards of 4,000 militia and Minutemen to then 1,700 regulars.
Okay, and we have a follow-up just from Joyce who asked that last question about how many soldiers did the British have versus the militia. She wrote when the fight began down the road.
When the fight began, there were 700 retreating from Concord.
Okay, great. And I see someone raised their hand. We don't have the capacity to have people speak at the webinar, but you are welcome to put questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, we have another one that came through the Q&A just now. Were the American brains behind this whole thing thinking revolution or just pushback?
I think it depends on the revolutionary. I think guys like Sam Adams were looking at revolution. They're looking at liberty, independence. I think people, even George Washington, I think he was, but eventually he kind of got pushed into the part as general. But I think more John Hancock, I think they had more to lose by by a revolution than not. I think they really were forced into what they did. Guys like Joseph Warren, definitely they didn't like what was happening to them. I don't think that they were looking for independence sake.
We have a great question that just came in through from Linda. What were the women doing to support the militia?
They were doing a lot, a lot. They were so all the ammunition. So if you've got muskets, you gotta roll the cartridges. So every musket has you've got a cartridge, and then the cartridge you've got, I think the standard at the time was probably around 19, between 19 and 25 cartridges. But each of those cartridges you've got to get paper cut, then you got to put your powder, your musket ball, roll it all up and tie it all up. You need to have a lot of those ready to go. Um, you had to have all the supplies that the soldiers need to be able to allow these guys to be ready in a minute's notice. They needed to help hide the supplies. There's there's so many stories. A lot of these are legends in Concord of the regulars going into the houses and saying, I need to check that bedroom upstairs. It's like, oh no, 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 no. Grandma's up there and she's not feeling well, so you can't go up there. It's like, well, I need to go up there. It's like, well, you can't wake grandma. Well, grandma was up there with 47 muskets, but all those sorts of things. It was every man, woman, and child was involved in one way or another, whether it was preparing things, hiding things, storing them, maintaining them, spreading information. even
Great.
even the enslaved people. So at um, the Hartwell Tavern, one of the first stops from Samuel Prescott. Their enslaved woman named Viola was told, and then she ran to all the neighboring towns, or not the neighboring towns, all the neighbors' houses and warned them. So it was a group effort.
Great. We have another question that came through from David. Which colonial leaders were most effective with their leadership at the time?
Um, John Hancock, obviously, I think one of the least applauded would be Joseph Warren. Um, he was a real firebrand. He was a doctor. He was absolutely selfless. Um, and I think had he survived Bunker Hill, he would be a household name.
Great. Oh, we have another one that came through. They keep coming in. Why were the colonists so heavily armed after all the French and Indian War was over and the Native American threat no longer existed?
Um, well, they continued even after the Revolution. Every town had a militia until 1840 in Massachusetts, anyway. So it didn't stop. They didn't know. Well, first they all needed a hunt, so they all needed things. They weren't necessarily preparing for. Um, they didn't know what they didn't know, and at the time, things were things can happen. Yeah, I mean, it's just like any time. They met. They had the militia. I don't know how seriously they took it, quite honestly. They got together. It's kind of like, the reserves. You're ready for something, you need to be prepared, but unless there's an imminent threat, are you really that ready? Um, Kind of how I think of it.
Great. Doug, you've done a great job answering so many questions. This is wonderful that people are so engaged. I don't see any more. Oh, just kidding. There's one in the chat. Oh, no, we just have thank yous. Yeah, thank you, Doug. From Nancy. This is very interesting, well presented. I
And
agree. Great job.
one other thing is,
Yeah.
if you're interested in more about Concord, if you go to visitconcord.org, we have walking tours that go through all of this. We specifically have one on Beyond 1775, which is really just about the Revolutionary War. But we've got Women in Concord, we've got Indigenous Peoples tours, we've got Patriots of Color every Saturday at 1:30. And this Saturday is the last one. It's been sponsored by the Mass Office of Tourism. So it's been free. This Saturdays is the last free one. After that, I think it's a nominal fee. But there's lots and lots of tours offered, and you get people like me and who just love this stuff. And yeah,
Great, Doug. You
away
can
we go.
tell.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
wonderful. We
That was
will send.
Charlestown paper last week.
That's great. I love it. I put in the chat as well if you want to stay in the know with upcoming events at AARP, you go to the aarp.org/local, and we will certainly be doing more webinars like this. Thank you to Doug. We really appreciate your expertise and knowledge and sharing it with everyone. And yes, the recording will be sent out to everyone who was able to join us today, and there are people who didn't make it who signed up. They will also get this recording as well. Our webinars go on our Massachusetts YouTube channel. So AARP Massachusetts has a YouTube channel. You can search for that and see all of our previously recorded webinars as well. So, all right, Doug, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Have a great day, everybody.
Welcome.